The crisp October morning air bit through my worn flannel shirt as I stood outside Mile High Storage on the outskirts of Denver. My breath formed small clouds in the 45-degree temperature, and I pulled my baseball cap lower over my eyes. The digital clock on the facility's office building read 7:47 a.m., and already a crowd of about 30 people had gathered for the monthly storage auction. I'd been coming to these auctions for about 8 months now, ever since my buddy Jake Martinez told me about the potential gold mines hidden in abandoned units. As a construction worker making $18 an hour framing houses in the rapidly growing suburbs around Denver, every extra dollar counted. My mother's medical bills back in Grand Junction were piling up faster than I could pay them, her diabetes and heart condition requiring constant monitoring and expensive medications that her insurance only partially covered. "Morning, Marcus," called out Dolores, an elderly woman who'd become a regular fixture at these auctions. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and claimed to have furnished her entire house with storage unit finds over the past 5 years. "You bidding on anything specific today?" "Just seeing what's available," I replied, sipping coffee from my thermos. "Got about $150 to work with." That $150 represented my entire entertainment budget for the month, scraped together from overtime shifts and skipping lunches. But if I could find something valuable, electronics, tools, furniture that I could resell at the weekend flea market, it might turn into $300 or $400. Sometimes you got lucky and found a unit full of antiques or collectibles that could pay for months of expenses. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Bob Kowalski, with a thick Colorado accent and a voice that could carry across a football stadium, was checking his clipboard and talking to Carol, the facility manager. Bob had been running these auctions for over a decade, and he had a reputation for being fair but fast-paced. If you hesitated during bidding, you'd lose your chance. "All right, folks," Bob's voice boomed across the storage facility. "We got 12 units going up for auction today. Rules are the same as always. Cash only. You got 1 week to clean out whatever you buy, and no going inside the units until the bidding's done. All sales final, no returns, no warranties. Everyone understand?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I recognized most of the faces. A mix of seasoned auction hunters, antique dealers, and people like me just trying to make some extra money. There was Jennifer, a young mother who sold children's clothes and toys online. Miguel, who had a small furniture refinishing business. And Big Tom, an intimidating guy who always seemed to know exactly which units to bid on and which to avoid. "Unit 147 first up," Bob announced, leading the crowd down the facility's main corridor. The first few units were disappointing, mostly old furniture, boxes of clothes, and the kind of random household items that might yield $20 or $30 at a garage sale. I didn't bid on any of them, watching as they went for prices that seemed too high for what was visible. "You're being smart," whispered Jake, who'd arrived late and caught up with the group. "These people are bidding with their hearts, not their heads." Jake was a plumber by trade, but had a good eye for valuable items. He'd taught me to look for certain signs in storage units, quality furniture pushed to the back, boxes that were carefully labeled and organized, anything that suggested the previous owner had money and took care of their possessions. "Unit 203, Bob called out, and we shuffled to the next location. This one caught my attention immediately. Unlike the cluttered, carelessly packed units we'd seen so far, this one was organized. A leather recliner sat prominently in front, facing a small wooden desk. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with what looked like technical manuals and financial publications. Several cardboard boxes were stacked with military precision against the back wall, each labeled in neat handwriting that I couldn't quite read from where I stood. "Belonged to some guy named Thompson," Bob was saying as he rolled up the metal door. "Been abandoned for 15 years, folks. Owner stopped paying in 2010, and we haven't been able to locate him or any family since then. Payment history shows he was good for it right up until December 2010, then just nothing. 15 years. I calculated quickly. That would mean the unit had been abandoned in 2010, when I was 17 years old. For some reason, that timeline made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. The crowd pressed closer to get a better look inside. I could see more details now. The desk had a hutch with small drawers and compartments, suggesting someone who needed organized storage for important papers. The books appeared to be about finance, investing, and business management. There was even what looked like a small filing cabinet tucked behind the chair. "What am I bid for Unit 203? Bob's voice cut through my observations. $30, called out a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a purple windbreaker and clutching a large purse. 50, countered Miguel, probably seeing potential in the furniture. Something about this unit felt different, familiar, though I couldn't place why. The way the furniture was arranged, the careful organization, even the handwriting on those box labels, something was tugging at the edge of my memory. 75! Big Tom's deep voice boomed from the back of the crowd. I should have walked away. My budget was $150, and bidding against experienced auction hunters was usually a losing proposition. But something was pulling me toward this particular unit, a feeling I couldn't shake that this was important somehow. 100, I called out, surprising myself. The crowd turned to look at me. I wasn't known for making aggressive bids, usually sticking to units that went for under $50. But this felt different. This felt like something I needed to win. 120. The woman in purple shot back immediately. My heart was pounding. $120 would leave me only $30 for the rest of the month, and there was no guarantee the unit contained anything valuable, but that nagging sense of familiarity wouldn't let go. 130, I heard myself say. Big Tom studied the unit for a long moment, then shook his head. Miguel had already stepped back from the bidding. The woman in purple looked at me, then at the unit, calculating whether it was worth going higher. 140, she called out, and I felt my stomach drop. I had exactly $152 in my wallet. With the buyer's premium, $140 would cost me about $154 total. I'd be broke until my next paycheck, living on whatever food I had in my apartment and hoping my truck didn't need gas. 150, I said, putting everything on the line. The woman studied me for a moment, then looked back at the unit. She shook her head and stepped back, too rich for my blood. Anyone else? Bob called out, scanning the crowd. Going once for 150, going twice, sold to the young man in the flannel shirt. As I walked toward Bob to pay, my hands were shaking. I'd just spent virtually every dollar I had on a storage unit based on nothing more than a gut feeling. Jake clapped me on the shoulder, but I could see the concern in his eyes. That was either really smart or really stupid, he murmured as I counted out bills. Guess we'll find out, I replied, though privately I was wondering what had possessed me to bid so aggressively. Bob handed me the paperwork and a lock cutter. Congratulations, son, you've got until next Friday to clean it out. Need any moving supplies? I think I'm good, I said, though honestly I had no idea how I was going to move furniture with just my pickup truck. As the crowd moved on to the next unit, I stood alone in front of my purchase. The storage facility felt quieter now, with most of the people following Bob down the corridor. I could hear the distant sounds of Denver traffic and the occasional airplane overhead, but this corner of the facility felt isolated, almost forgotten. I walked closer to the unit and tried to read the handwriting on those carefully labeled boxes. The letters were neat, precise, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who paid attention to details. One box was labeled Financial Records 2005-2010. Another said Personal Items, Important. A third was marked Professional Documents. But it was when I looked at the desk that my blood ran cold. Sitting on top, partially hidden under what looked like a leather portfolio, was an envelope with a name written across the front in that same careful handwriting, David M. Thompson. My father's name. My father who had disappeared without a trace 15 years ago, leaving behind only debts, unanswered questions, and a family that had never recovered from his abandonment. I stood there for a full minute, staring at that envelope, my mind racing through possibilities. Coincidence? There had to be thousands of Thompsons in Colorado, but David M. Thompson, that was too specific, too exact, and the timeline fit. The unit had been abandoned in December 2010, just 2 months after my father had disappeared, leaving my mother and me to wonder if he was dead, in prison, or simply didn't care enough to come home. With shaking hands, I cut the lock and rolled up the storage unit door completely. The October morning sun streamed into the unit, illuminating details I hadn't been able to see clearly before. The leather chair was high quality, the kind of furniture my father had always admired but claimed we couldn't afford. The books on the shelves included titles about precious metals investing, numismatics, and financial planning, subjects my father had shown interest in during his final months at home. I picked up the envelope with his name on it. It wasn't sealed, and inside I found a copy of a driver's license, a social security card, and what looked like insurance papers. The photo on the license made my knees weak. It was definitely my father, though the address listed wasn't our family home on Maple Street. It was an apartment complex on the other side of Denver, a place I'd never heard him mention. The date on the license was from 2009, during the year before he disappeared, which meant that during his final months with our family, my father had been living a double life, maintaining a secret apartment and apparently preparing for something that required careful planning and hidden resources. But why? What had he been planning? And if he'd had access to a storage unit full of furniture and organized files, why had he left my mother and me struggling with bills and wondering if we'd ever see him again? I pulled out my phone and called Jake. "I need your help," I said when he answered. "And I need your truck. Something big is happening here and I don't understand what it is yet." As I waited for Jake to finish at the auction and come back to help me, I stood in my father's secret storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd never known he'd lived. The morning sun was getting warmer, promising a beautiful October day, but I felt cold inside, afraid of what other secrets I might uncover in the boxes and files that represented 15 years of unanswered questions. The envelope with my father's name had been just the beginning. As I would soon discover, David Thompson had left behind more than just furniture and paperwork. Hidden somewhere in this carefully organized unit was a treasure that would change my life forever, and possibly provide the answers to questions that had haunted my family since the day he walked out of our lives and never came back. Jake arrived 20 minutes later, driving his battered Ford pickup that had seen better decades, but could haul more than my smaller truck. He took one look at my face and knew something serious was happening. "You look like you've seen a ghost, man," he said, climbing out of his truck with a thermos of coffee and a box of donuts from the gas station. "What's got you so spooked?" I showed him the envelope with my father's name, explaining the timeline and the impossibility of it being a coincidence. Jake whistled low as he examined the driver's license. "Same address as your dad growing up?" "No, that's the weird part. This address is on the other side of Denver, somewhere he never mentioned living. And look at the date. This was issued in 2009 when he was still living at home with us." Jake studied the license photo, comparing it to his memories of my father from the few times they'd met. "It's definitely him, but why would he need a second driver's license with a different address?" That was just one of many questions I didn't have answers to. We spent the next hour carefully removing items from the storage unit, treating everything like potential evidence, in a mystery we were just beginning to understand. The leather chair was heavier than it looked, requiring both of us to maneuver it into Jake's truck bed. The desk came apart into several pieces, revealing small compartments and drawers that had been invisible when it was assembled. "Your dad was organized," Jake observed as we worked through the boxes. "Look at this filing system." Each box was meticulously labeled and dated. Tax records 2005-2009 contained exactly what it promised: years of carefully maintained tax returns, receipts, and financial documentation. But these weren't the records of the struggling insurance salesman I remembered from my childhood. These documents showed significant income from sources I didn't recognize: DM Thompson Consulting, Investment Research Services, and Asset Recovery Solutions. "Marcus, look at this," Jake said, holding up a bank statement from October 2010. "This account shows regular deposits of $3,000 to $5,000 every month. Where was your dad getting this kind of money?" I stared at the statement, trying to reconcile it with my memories of our family's financial struggles. During that same period, my mother had been working 2 part-time jobs to help pay the mortgage, and I'd been delivering pizzas after school to contribute to household expenses. Yet, apparently my father had access to thousands of dollars that he'd never shared with his family. The bank statements revealed other surprises: regular payments to something called Mile High Storage, the very facility where we were now standing; monthly transfers to First National Precious Metals; substantial deposits into accounts at 3 different banks, suggesting someone who was deliberately spreading his assets around. "So there's more," I said, opening another box labeled Professional Correspondence. This one contained letters, contracts, and what looked like case files. The letterhead on many of the documents read Castellano Investigations, with a Denver address and phone number. Jake read over my shoulder as I examined one of the contracts. It was written in legal language that was hard to follow, but the basic terms seemed to involve my father providing financial investigation and asset recovery services in exchange for substantial fees. The contract was dated June 2008 and signed by both my father and someone named Vincent Castellano. "Your dad was some kind of private investigator?" Jake asked. "I don't know. He never mentioned anything like this. As far as I knew, he sold insurance policies and barely made enough money to keep us afloat. But the evidence was mounting that David Thompson had been living two separate lives. The professional correspondence revealed a man who specialized in finding hidden assets, tracking down financial fraud, and helping clients recover money that had been stolen or concealed. The fees for his services were substantial, often $10,000 to $20,000 per case. One letter, dated November 2010, caught my attention immediately. It was from Vincent Castellano, marked Urgent, in red ink across the top. David, the Meridian Properties situation has taken a dangerous turn. My sources indicate that Romano and his associates are aware of your investigation and are not pleased with what you've uncovered. I strongly recommend that you suspend all activities related to this case and consider relocating until the situation calms down. The safety of your family should be your primary concern at this point. These are not people who make idle threats, and they have resources that extend well beyond Colorado. We need to discuss your options immediately. Call me when you receive this. Vincent. The letter was dated November 15, 2010, exactly 3 weeks before my father disappeared. Jake, I think my dad was in some kind of trouble. Real trouble with dangerous people. We continued searching through the boxes, looking for more clues about this Meridian Properties case and the people who had apparently driven my father into hiding. What we found instead was something that made all the financial documents and correspondence seem insignificant by comparison. In the back corner of the storage unit, partially hidden behind a stack of financial magazines, was a black metal safe. It was about the size of a large microwave, with a digital keypad and a small display that showed a red locked indicator when Jake accidentally bumped against it. Holy shit, Jake breathed. Think there's anything good in there? The safe was a Sentry safe model, probably from the late 1990s based on its design. It was too heavy to lift, had to weigh at least 200 pounds, and appeared to be bolted to a wooden base that suggested it had been permanently installed wherever my father had been living. We need to get this thing open, I said, though I had no idea how. But first, let's see if we can find the combination written down somewhere. We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, checking behind every photograph, looking inside every book. Nothing. My father had been too careful to leave the combination lying around where someone might find it. I was ready to give up and hire a locksmith when Jake found something interesting. Tucked inside a book about coin collecting was a small notebook with what appeared to be codes and numbers. Most of it made no sense, but one page had a list of dates and numbers that looked promising. MB, 10/23, 1992, wedding, 06/15, 1985, first house, 11/08, 1987, important, 213, MB. Could be Marcus's birthday, Jake suggested. October 23rd, 1992, that's you, right? Yeah, but I already tried that combination in several variations. Same with my parents' wedding date. What about this last one? 213. I stared at the numbers, trying to figure out what they might represent. Then it hit me. Not 213 as a date, but as a code. My father used to play word games when I was little, always saying that the most important things were hidden in plain sight. My birthday backwards, I said suddenly. Not October 23rd, but 23 October. Day first, then month 2310. But what if he simplified it to just 213? February 1st, or maybe just the pattern itself? Jake shrugged. Worth a try. I knelt in front of the safe and carefully entered the digits. 213. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft electronic beep that made both of us jump, the display changed from red to green, and I heard the mechanical sound of bolts retracting inside the safe. No fucking way, Jake whispered. With trembling hands, I pulled the heavy door open. The interior was lined with grey felt and organized into several compartments. The top shelf contained documents in plastic protective sleeves. The bottom held several small, heavy boxes that clinked softly when moved. But it was the middle shelf that made me gasp and nearly fall backward. Rows and rows of individual plastic coin holders, each containing what appeared to be silver dollars. They gleamed in the October sunlight, streaming through the storage unit opening, and even to my untrained eye, some of them looked very old. I counted quickly, at least 60 coins, maybe more, each one professionally graded and labeled. Are those real? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I picked up one of the coin holders with shaking hands. The coin inside was heavy, much heavier than any modern coin I'd ever held. The date read 1884, and the inscription showed Morgan Silver Dollar. The plastic holder was labeled with what looked like professional grading information, MS-63, and other abbreviations I didn't understand. But there was something else written on the holder in my father's careful handwriting. First purchase, M's Future, DT 1995. I would have been 3 years old. My father had started this collection when I was barely out of diapers, planning for my future even then. Jake, pull out your phone. Look up what these are worth. While Jake Googled Morgan silver dollars, I carefully examined more of the coins. There were Morgan dollars from various years in the 1880s and 1890s, peace dollars from the 1920s, and what looked like even older coins I couldn't immediately identify. Each was professionally graded and stored in its protective holder, and many had small white stickers with numbers written in my father's handwriting. "Dude," Jake said, his eyes wide as he read from his phone screen, "a Morgan silver dollar in good condition can be worth anywhere from $50 to $500, depending on the year and condition. Some rare dates can be worth thousands." I felt dizzy as I counted the coins more carefully. 67 Morgan dollars, 23 peace dollars, and several other silver coins I didn't recognize. Even at the low end of Jake's estimates, I was looking at potentially tens of thousands of dollars, more money than I'd ever had at one time in my life. But it was the documents in the top shelf of the safe that provided the real shock. Among the certificates of authenticity and purchase receipts was a handwritten letter addressed to me, dated December 10th, 2010, just days before my father's disappearance. "Marcus, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've somehow found your way to the things I've been keeping safe for our family. I know you must have questions, and I know you must be angry. You have every right to be. I never meant for things to happen the way they did. When I left in December 2010, I thought I was protecting you and your mother from something that was my responsibility alone. I was wrong about many things, but I was right about the danger. The people I was investigating were not the kind to forgive or forget. The coins in this safe represent 15 years of careful planning and investment. Every extra dollar I could manage went into building this collection, not for me, but for you and your mom. I studied the market, learned about grading and authenticity, and chose each piece carefully. The collection is worth significantly more than what I paid for it. As of this writing, based on current market values and the professional appraisals I've obtained, the collection should be worth approximately $125,000. That's enough to pay off your mother's medical bills, help you finish school, and provide some financial security for both of you. But Marcus, this is just the beginning. There are other assets, other investments I've made over the years. The coin collection was meant to be easily discovered and accessed if something happened to me. The rest will require more work to find, but it's there, waiting for you when you're ready. I know this doesn't make up for my absence, and I know it doesn't excuse the pain I've caused. But I hope it can give you and your mother some peace of mind, and maybe help you understand that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. The combination to this safe is 213, your birthday reversed, the way I used to write important dates when you were little. Do you remember? I always said the most important things should be hidden in plain sight. I love you more than you'll ever know, son. Take care of your mother, and know that every day I'm away from you both is a choice I make to keep you safe. Dad, P.S. If you need help understanding any of this, or if you want to know the whole truth about why I had to leave, contact Vincent Castellano at the number in my files. He's one of the few people who knows the complete story, and he can be trusted. I read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit me. $125,000. My mother's medical bills totaled about $40,000. With that much money, she could afford the best specialists, the latest treatments, maybe even retire from the 2 part-time jobs she'd been working to make ends meet. But the letter also confirmed my worst fears about why my father had disappeared. He hadn't abandoned us. He'd been protecting us from people dangerous enough to force him into hiding. And according to the letter, there were more assets hidden somewhere waiting to be discovered. Jake was staring at me with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Marcus, this changes everything. Your dad didn't just run off. He was trying to take care of you guys." I looked around the storage unit, at the carefully organized boxes and the professional-grade safe, at the evidence of a man who had spent years preparing for the possibility that he might have to disappear to protect his family. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered, but one question remained. If my father had gone to such lengths to provide for us, why had he never tried to contact us in the 15 years since he'd disappeared? Was he still alive? And if so, was he still in danger? The answers to those questions, I was beginning to realize, might be worth more than all the silver in that safe, and they might also be more dangerous than I was prepared to handle. As Jake and I loaded the precious coins into my truck, treating each one like the treasure it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that safe had started something I might not be able to finish. But for the first time in 15 years, I had hope that I might finally learn the truth about what had happened to David Thompson and whether my father was ever coming home. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table in my Aurora apartment, surrounded by my father's documents and a pizza that had gone cold hours ago. Jake had helped me move everything from the storage unit, but now I was alone with the overwhelming task of making sense of 15 years of carefully hidden secrets. The coin collection sat in a locked metal box beside me. I'd been too paranoid to leave it in my truck overnight. Every few minutes I'd open the box just to confirm that the coins were real, that this wasn't some elaborate dream brought on by too much stress and too little sleep. But it was the financial records that were slowly revealing the true scope of my father's hidden life. Bank statements from 3 different institutions showed a pattern of regular deposits, careful investments, and strategic asset purchases that painted a picture of a man who had been methodically building wealth while his family believed they were struggling to make ends meet. One set of statements particularly caught my attention. From 2008 through 2010, my father had been making regular purchases from a company called Colorado Premium Metals. The amounts ranged from $500 to $2,000 per month, and the purchase descriptions included terms like American Eagles, maple leafs, and 90% silver coins. He hadn't just been collecting rare numismatic pieces, he'd been systematically converting cash into precious metals. But where had all that cash been coming from? The answer lay in a folder labeled Castellano Investigations, Case Files. Inside were copies of contracts, invoices, and what appeared to be case summaries for investigations my father had conducted between 2007 and 2010. The fees were substantial, often $10,000 to $25,000 per case, and the work involved tracking down assets that had been hidden, stolen, or fraudulently transferred. One case file was thicker than the others and marked with a red, confidential stamp. The client was listed as Metropolitan Development Corp., and the case involved investigating financial irregularities in a real estate development project called Meridian Properties. According to the file, someone had been systematically skimming money from investor funds, using a complex network of shell companies to hide the theft. My father's notes were detailed and damning. He'd traced over $3.2 million in missing investor funds, identifying the perpetrators and documenting their methods. But the final entry in the file, dated November 20, 2010, was ominous. V. Castellano advised me today that subjects are aware of investigation. Tony Romano, primary target, has connections to organized crime elements in Denver and Chicago. Romano's attorney contacted Castellano directly, making veiled threats about consequences if investigation continues. Decision: case suspension recommended for safety reasons. All evidence secured in multiple locations. Client has been advised that prosecution may not be feasible given security concerns. Personal note: Romano knows who I am and where I live. Need to consider contingency plans discussed with VC. Family safety is primary concern. The timeline was becoming clear. In November 2010, my father had uncovered a major financial crime involving dangerous people. Those people had found out about his investigation and made threats. 3 weeks later, he'd disappeared, leaving behind only debts and unanswered questions for his family. But there was still one piece missing from the puzzle. If my father had been in danger and needed to disappear, why hadn't he taken us with him? Why hadn't he at least tried to explain what was happening? I found a partial answer in a letter tucked inside the Meridian Properties file. It was handwritten, apparently a draft of something my father had intended to send but never did. Sarah, my mother's name, I know you're going to be angry, and I know you're going to think I'm abandoning you and Marcus. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm leaving because staying would put you both in danger that you don't deserve and didn't choose. The work I've been doing has made me enemies, serious enemies who don't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get what they want. As long as they think I might continue my investigation, they'll view my family as leverage they can use against me. But if I disappear completely, if they believe I'm no longer a threat, then you and Marcus should be safe. I've left you assets that should provide for your needs. The storage unit contains coins and documents that are worth enough to pay off the house and Marcus's college. Vincent Castellano has instructions to help you access these assets if something happens to me. I know this seems like I'm running away, but I'm actually running toward danger, drawing it away from you. If these people want to come after me, they can try, but they'll have to find me first. And I don't intend to make that easy. I love you both more than my own life. That's why I have to go. David. The letter had never been sent. Maybe my father had realized that trying to explain would only make things harder, or maybe he'd run out of time. But it showed that his disappearance had been an act of protection, not abandonment. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. It was nearly 11 p.m., but she was usually up late watching her crime shows, and this couldn't wait until morning. "Marcus, is everything okay, honey?" Her voice carried that immediate worry that mothers seem to develop when their children call at unusual hours. "Mum, I need to come see you. Tomorrow. And I need to ask you about Dad, about the months before he left." A long pause. "You found something, didn't you?" The fact that she knew, without me explaining anything, told me she'd been keeping secrets too. "I found his storage unit, Mom. The one he was paying for all those years. It's full of coins and documents, and he left us a letter." I heard her sharp intake of breath, then the sound of her settling into her recliner, the same one she'd used for 15 years, where she'd waited and worried and wondered if her husband was alive or dead. "I always wondered if you'd find it someday," she said quietly. "I found records of payments to that storage place after he left, but I could never figure out how to access it. I didn't even know which facility it was." "You knew about the storage unit?" "I knew he was hiding money somewhere. Those last few months he kept talking about insurance and contingency plans. He'd get these phone calls that would make him pale and distracted. He started working late, supposedly meeting with clients, but when I'd call his office, they'd say he hadn't been in all day." "Mum, did he ever mention someone named Vincent Castellano?" Another pause, longer this time. "Once. He said Vincent was someone who could help us if anything ever happened to him, but he wouldn't explain what he meant by that." I spent the next hour on the phone with my mother, sharing what I'd learned and listening to details about my father's final months that she'd never told me before. The pattern that emerged was of a man under increasing pressure, someone who knew he was running out of time and options. She confirmed that there had been strange phone calls, late-night meetings, and a growing sense of paranoia that had begun to affect his behavior at home. She'd found notes in his handwriting with addresses and phone numbers, but when she'd asked about them, he'd claimed they were related to insurance claims he was investigating. "There was one night," she said, "about a week before he left. I woke up around 2 a.m. and found him sitting at the kitchen table with all these papers spread out. Financial documents, maps, what looked like surveillance photographs. When he saw me, he gathered everything up quickly and said he was working on a case that might finally let us get ahead financially." "Did you see any of the photographs clearly?" "One of them showed a man getting into a black SUV. Your father had written something on the back of it, but I couldn't read it in the dim light. He was very secretive about the whole thing." After we hung up, I sat staring at the coin collection, trying to process everything I'd learned. My father hadn't been the struggling insurance salesman I'd remembered from childhood. He'd been a financial investigator working dangerous cases for substantial fees. He'd discovered a major crime involving people connected to organized crime, and when those people had threatened his family, he'd made the decision to disappear rather than put us at risk. But 15 years had passed since then. The people who had forced him into hiding might be dead in prison or no longer interested in a case from 2010. If my father was still alive, it might finally be safe for him to come home, or at least to contact his family. The letter had mentioned that Vincent Castellano could be trusted with the whole truth. According to the business cards in my father's files, Castellano Investigations was still operating at a Denver address. The phone number was still active. I'd confirmed that with a quick internet search. Tomorrow, after I visited my mother and shared the coin collection with her, I would make the call that might finally answer the question that had haunted our family for 15 years. What had happened to David Thompson, and was he ever coming home? But as I locked the coins away and tried to get some sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets were dangerous to uncover, and some questions were better left unanswered. The men who had forced my father into hiding hadn't been the type to forgive and forget. Even after 15 years, reaching out to Vincent Castellano might be putting myself and my mother at risk. On the other hand, the alternative was spending the rest of our lives wondering what had happened to the man who had sacrificed everything to keep us safe. And that, I realized, was a risk I was finally ready to take. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and made the 4-hour drive to Grand Junction. My foreman, Rodriguez, wasn't happy about my second consecutive absence, but I promised to work overtime for the next 2 weeks to make up for it. Right now, my mother needed to know what I'd found, and I needed to understand everything she remembered about my father's final months. The drive through the Colorado mountains gave me time to think about what I was going to tell her. The coin collection was worth enough to pay off her medical bills and set her up comfortably for the rest of her life. But the knowledge that her husband had been investigating dangerous criminals and might still be alive somewhere, hiding to protect us, that was going to be harder to process. I found her in her small kitchen making coffee and looking older than her 58 years. The diabetes and heart problems had aged her, but it was the years of worry and uncertainty that had really taken their toll. When she saw the metal box I was carrying, her eyes filled with tears before I even opened it. "Are those—" she began, then couldn't finish the sentence. I opened the box and showed her the coin collection, watching her face as she picked up one of the Morgan dollars and held it up to the morning light. Her hands were shaking, and I realized this was the first tangible proof she'd had in 15 years that her husband had truly cared about his family's future. "He started collecting these when you were 3 years old," I said, showing her the notation on the first coin holder. "Every month, sometimes more often, adding to the collection, planning for our future even then." She read my father's letter twice, crying silently as she absorbed the magnitude of what he'd been trying to do. The love in his words, the careful planning, the sacrifice of disappearing to keep us safe, it reframed everything we'd believed about his abandonment. "I need to show you something," she said when she finished reading. "I should have shown you years ago, but I was afraid it would make the pain worse." She led me to her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser, pulling out a shoebox that contained items she'd saved from my father's final months. Bank statements, business cards, handwritten notes, and a small address book with phone numbers and locations that meant nothing to me but had apparently been important to him. "I found all this hidden in his desk after he left," she explained. "Most of it didn't make sense to me, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. One item immediately caught my attention, a business card for Romano Construction and Development with Tony Romano's name embossed in gold letters. Someone had written "Dangerous" across the back of the card in my father's handwriting, along with a phone number and the notation "VC Backup Plan." "Mom, did Dad ever mention Tony Romano specifically?" She thought for a moment. "That name sounds familiar. I think he might have been one of the men your father was investigating. Why?" I showed her the business card and explained what I'd learned about the Meridian Properties case. Her face went pale as she realized the implications. "You mean he was investigating real criminals? People who would actually hurt someone?" "It looks that way. And according to the documents I found, these people discovered what Dad was doing and made threats against our family. We spent the next several hours going through everything together, piecing together a timeline of my father's final months. The picture that emerged was of a man who had gotten in over his head, investigating a case that was more dangerous than he'd initially realized. But instead of backing down, he'd continued gathering evidence until he'd uncovered a massive fraud scheme. Among my mother's saved items was the appointment book from 2010 that provided crucial details. In the weeks before his disappearance, my father had met regularly with Vincent Castellano, visited safe deposit boxes at multiple banks, and made several trips to precious metals dealers. The appointments showed a man preparing for the possibility that he might have to disappear quickly. But there was something else in the appointment book that I hadn't expected: scheduled meetings with someone identified only as JR FBI. The meetings had occurred in October and early November 2010, suggesting that my father had been working with federal agents on the Romano investigation. "Mom, did Dad ever mention anything about working with the FBI?" "Not directly, but there were a couple of times when he took phone calls and went outside to finish them. When I asked who was calling, he said it was work stuff and seemed uncomfortable talking about it. I was working with federal agents. It suggested that the Romano case was part of a larger investigation, but it also raised questions about why he'd felt the need to disappear if he'd had FBI protection. The answer came in a sealed envelope I found at the bottom of my mother's shoebox, marked, 'Open only if something happens to David.' Inside was a letter addressed to her, dated November 30th, 2010, just 5 days before his disappearance. 'Sarah, if you're reading this, then the situation with the Romano investigation has become untenable, and I've had to activate the contingency plan Vincent and I discussed. The FBI agents I've been working with are good people, but they can't provide 24-hour protection for our family indefinitely. Romano has connections that extend beyond what law enforcement can easily monitor or control. His attorney has made it clear that my continued cooperation with the federal investigation puts you and Marcus at risk. Agent Jennifer Rodriguez assures me that they have enough evidence to proceed without my testimony, but only if I disappear completely. As long as Romano's people believe I might resurface to testify, they'll view our family as a potential threat. But if I vanish without a trace, if they believe I'm either dead or permanently out of the picture, then you and Marcus should be safe. I've transferred our assets to accounts and investments that you can access, but that can't be traced back to me. The storage unit contains the most liquid assets. The coin collection should be worth enough to pay off the house and Marcus's education. Vincent has the details of everything else. I know this seems like I'm abandoning you, but I'm actually protecting you in the only way I know how. Romano's people are capable of violence, and they've made it clear they won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get what they want. I can't let that happen to my family. Contact Vincent Castellano when you're ready to understand the full scope of what I've arranged for your financial security. Tell him you need to know about the Montana account and the Phoenix properties. He'll know what that means. I love you both more than life itself. That's why I have to go. David. The letter revealed several crucial pieces of information. My father had been working with an FBI agent named Jennifer Rodriguez. The Romano case had been part of a larger federal investigation, and there were more assets hidden beyond the coin collection, something called the Montana account and Phoenix properties. Mom, we need to contact Vincent Castellano, I said. Dad wanted us to know about these other assets, and it sounds like Castellano has been holding on to information for 15 years, waiting for us to be ready to hear it. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. What if contacting him puts us in danger? What if these Romano people are still out there? It was a valid concern, but I thought about my mother's medical bills, about the opportunity to finally learn the truth about my father's fate, and about the possibility that 15 years had been long enough for the danger to pass. We'll be careful, I said. But Mum, we can't spend the rest of our lives wondering what happened to him. And if there are assets out there that he intended for us to have, we owe it to his memory to claim them. That evening, back in Denver, I sat in my truck outside my apartment building with Vincent Castellano's business card in my hand. I'd found 3 different phone numbers for him in my father's files, his office, a cell phone, and what appeared to be an emergency contact number. I decided to start with the office number. It rang 4 times before a professional-sounding woman answered. Castellano Investigations. This is Maria speaking. I'd like to speak with Vincent Castellano, please. It's regarding David Thompson. A pause. May I ask who's calling? Marcus Thompson, David Thompson's son. Please hold for just a moment. The hold lasted nearly 5 minutes, long enough for me to start wondering if I'd made a mistake. Then a gravelly voice came on the line, older than I'd expected, but alert and cautious. Marcus Thompson? Yes, sir. Jesus Christ, kid. I was wondering when you'd finally call. Your father said you were smart enough to find your way to the truth eventually. How much do you know? I found his storage unit, the coin collection, the case files, the letter he left for me. I know about the Romano investigation and why he had to disappear. Where are you calling from? Denver. I'm sitting in my truck outside my apartment. That's not secure enough for this conversation. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. You know Washington Park, on the south side of Denver? Yes. There's a pavilion near the lily pond. Come alone. Don't bring any recording devices and make sure nobody follows you. We've got 15 years of catching up to do, and some of it might be hard to hear. Mr. Castellano, is my father still alive? A long pause. Yeah, kid, he's alive. But that's just the beginning of what you need to know. See you tomorrow. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my truck with my heart pounding. My father was alive. After 15 years of wondering, of assuming the worst, of grieving for a man who might be dead, he was alive somewhere, still in hiding, still protecting his family from dangers I was only beginning to understand. But Vincent Castellano's tone had suggested that learning the truth would come with complications I wasn't prepared for. As I walked up to my apartment, carrying the metal box of silver coins that represented my father's love and sacrifice, I wondered if some secrets were too dangerous to uncover, and whether the truth about David Thompson would set our family free or put us in more danger than we'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, I would finally learn what had happened to my father. And I would discover that some mysteries once solved create new problems that are far more complex than the original questions. Washington Park was busier than I'd expected for a Wednesday afternoon in late October. The autumn leaves were at their peak, drawing photographers and families out to enjoy what might be one of the last warm days before winter set in. I arrived at the pavilion near the lily pond 15 minutes early, wanting to observe the area and make sure I hadn't been followed. At exactly 2 p.m., I saw a man walking toward me from the parking area, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive-looking grey overcoat that probably cost more than I made in a month. Despite being in his late 60s now, he moved with the controlled confidence of someone who'd spent his career dealing with dangerous situations. "Marcus Thompson?" he asked as he approached. "That's me." Vincent Castellano studied me for a long moment, and I could see him comparing me to his memories of my father. His eyes were sharp and calculating, but there was a warmth there too, as if he'd been genuinely fond of David Thompson. "You look like him," he said finally. "Same eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw. Your father was a good man, kid. One of the best investigators I ever worked with." "Where is he?" Castellano gestured toward a bench overlooking the pond. "Sit down, son. This is going to take a while, and some of it might be difficult to hear." As we settled on the bench, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope, weathered from years of storage. "Your father worked for me for about 4 years, from 2006 to 2010. He wasn't selling insurance. That was just his cover story, a way to explain the irregular hours and the travel. David was what you might call a financial forensics specialist. He had a talent for finding assets that people had hidden, tracking down complex money trails, uncovering financial fraud that traditional law enforcement couldn't touch." I stared at him, trying to reconcile this description with my memories of the man who'd struggled to pay our mortgage and had clipped coupons to save money on groceries. My dad was some kind of private investigator, more like a forensic accountant with street smarts and connections in the financial world. I had clients, legitimate business people who'd been cheated by partners, had assets stolen, been victims of elaborate Ponzi schemes or investment fraud. Sometimes the crimes were too complex for local police. Sometimes the money had been moved offshore where traditional law enforcement couldn't reach it. "That's where your father came in." Castellano opened the envelope and showed me photographs, surveillance reports, and financial documents, all bearing my father's name and signature. David was exceptionally good at his job. He could trace money through dozens of shell companies, identify hidden assets, and build cases that would hold up in court. His fees were substantial because his results were outstanding. Over 4 years, he helped recover almost $12 million for clients who'd been defrauded. But something went wrong with the Romano case. Everything went wrong with the Romano case. Castellano's expression darkened. Tony Romano was a Denver real estate developer who'd been running an investment scam through something called Meridian Properties. On the surface, it looked like a legitimate real estate development, luxury condominiums, commercial properties, that sort of thing. But Romano was systematically stealing money from his investors, using new investor funds to pay returns to earlier investors while skimming millions for himself. He showed me photographs of Romano, a heavy-set man in his 50s with dead eyes and expensive suits, someone who looked like he'd be equally comfortable at a country club or ordering someone's death. The problem was that Romano had connections beyond the financial world. His brother-in-law was Vincent "Vinny the Fish" Torino, a made guy in the Chicago outfit. Romano's construction company had been used to launder money for organized crime figures for years. When your father started investigating the Meridian Properties fraud, he unknowingly stumbled into a much larger criminal enterprise. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze coming off the pond. And they found out what he was doing. Romano's people were sophisticated. They had lawyers who knew how to identify investigation techniques, and they had connections in law enforcement who could provide information about ongoing cases. By October 2010, they knew that David Thompson was the investigator who'd uncovered their fraud, and they knew enough about his methods to be worried about what else he might find. Castellano pulled out a surveillance photograph, my father, taken with a telephoto lens as he walked out of a bank, clearly unaware he was being watched. They started following him, photographing his movements, documenting his contacts, building a profile of his family and his routine. The message was clear. We know who you are, we know where you live, and we can reach you anytime we want. So he ran. He made a choice between several bad options. He could have turned over his evidence to the FBI and hoped for the best, knowing that these people had long memories and extensive resources. He could have dropped the investigation and hoped they'd leave him alone, knowing that other investors would continue to lose their money. Or he could disappear completely, taking the evidence with him but drawing the danger away from his family. Castellano handed me a photograph that made my breath catch. My father, but older than I remembered him, taken on what looked like a tropical beach. He was wearing sunglasses and a fishing hat, but it was definitely him. The timestamp on the photo showed a date from just 6 months ago. He's alive. The words came out as barely a whisper. Very much so. Living quietly in a small coastal town in Belize, working as a fishing guide under the name Daniel Tucker. It's a simple life, but it's safe, and it's allowed him to stay completely off the grid for 15 years. I stared at the photograph, emotions crashing over me like waves. Relief that he was alive, anger that he'd let us believe he might be dead, confusion about why he'd never tried to contact us, and a strange pride that he'd survived 15 years in hiding. Why didn't he ever reach out? Why didn't he at least let us know he was okay? Because he knew that any contact would put you at risk. Romano's people weren't the forgiving type, and they had resources to monitor communications, trace phone calls, follow money transfers. As long as they believed David might be dead, you were safe, but any sign that he was alive and in contact with his family would have put targets on your backs. The storage unit was his way of providing for us without making contact. Smart kid, your father paid for that unit faithfully for years, adding to the coin collection whenever he could safely do so. He knew that eventually either you or your mother would find it through the auction system or by tracking down his financial records. The coins were his insurance policy, valuable enough to solve your family's immediate financial problems, but not so liquid that they'd attract unwanted attention. Castellano reached into the envelope and pulled out more documents. Bank statements, investment records, and what looked like property deeds. But the coin collection was just the beginning, Marcus. Your father has been working and saving for 15 years, building assets in accounts and investments that can't be traced back to him. He's been preparing for the day when it might be safe to either come home or to transfer those assets to his family. How much money are we talking about? The Montana account your father mentioned in his letter, that's a portfolio of precious metals and conservative investments worth approximately $340,000. The Phoenix properties are 2 rental houses that have been generating income and appreciating in value for 12 years. Current combined value is around $280,000. I felt dizzy as I tried to process the numbers. Combined with the coin collection, my father had accumulated over $750,000 in assets while living in exile, working as a fishing guide in Belize. And the Romano people, are they still a threat? Castellano smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. That's where the story gets interesting. Tony Romano died in federal prison in 2018, serving a 20-year sentence for racketeering and fraud. His brother-in-law Vinny Torino was killed in a Chicago restaurant in 2019, something about a territorial dispute with a rival family. Most of the other key figures are either dead, in prison, or no longer in positions where they'd care about a 15-year-old investigation. So it might be safe for him to come home? It might be. But bringing him home safely would require careful planning and professional help, new identity documents, legal assistance, security consultants who specialize in this kind of situation. It's not cheap, but it's possible. Castellano leaned back on the bench and looked out over the pond, where families were feeding ducks and children were playing on the playground equipment. There's something else you need to know, Marcus. Your father has been following your life as closely as he could from a distance. He knows about your mother's health problems, your construction job, your failed engagement a few years back. He's been desperate to help, to be there for the important moments, but he couldn't risk it. He pulled out one final item from the envelope, a letter in my father's handwriting, but with a recent date. He wrote this 6 months ago when his contact in Denver, me, told him about your mother's latest health scare. He's been preparing to take the risk of coming home, willing to accept whatever dangers might remain, because he can't stand the thought of missing any more time with his family. I took the letter with trembling hands. Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll know most of the truth about why I had to leave and what I've been doing for the past 15 years. I hope you can understand that every day away from you and your mother has been a choice I made to keep you safe, not because I didn't love you enough to stay. I know I've missed too much. Your graduation, your birthdays, the chance to help with your mother's medical problems, the opportunity to be the father you deserved. But I also know that staying would have put you both at risk from people who don't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get what they want. If Vincent is showing you this letter, it means the situation has changed enough that coming home might be possible. It won't be easy, and it won't be without risks, but I can't spend the rest of my life in exile when my family needs me. The money I've saved is for you and your mother, enough to ensure that you never have to worry about medical bills or financial security again. But more than that, I want the chance to be part of your lives again, to make up for some of the lost time, to be the husband and father I should have been all along. The decision has to be yours, son. I won't risk your safety or your mother's, not even for the chance to come home. But if you think it's worth the risk, if you want to help me find a way back to the family I never stopped loving, then Vincent can help us make it happen. I'm proud of the man you've become, Marcus. Your mother did an amazing job raising you, and I hope someday I can tell you in person how sorry I am for all the years I couldn't be there. With all my love, Dad. As I finished reading, I realized that the silver coins in that storage unit had been more than just a financial safety net. They'd been a message, a promise, and a hope that someday, somehow, David Thompson might find a way to come home to the family he'd sacrificed everything to protect. The question now was whether I was brave enough to help him do it, and whether our family was strong enough to survive the risks that bringing him home might entail. 6 months later, I stood in the arrivals area of Denver International Airport, holding a sign with the name Daniel Tucker written in black marker. My palms were sweating despite the March chill, and I'd checked my watch at least 50 times in the past hour. The 6 months between my meeting with Vincent Castellano and this moment had been a whirlwind of legal consultations, security assessments, and careful planning. Castellano had been as good as his word. The men who'd forced my father into exile were indeed gone, victims of their own violent lifestyle and federal prosecution. The FBI case that had originally driven him underground had been closed for years, with Romano and his associates convicted, based on evidence that hadn't required my father's testimony. But bringing David Thompson home safely had still required extensive preparation. New identity documents that could withstand scrutiny, legal assistance to resolve 15 years of complications, security consultations to assess remaining risks, financial planning to manage the assets he'd accumulated in exile, and, most importantly, the emotional preparation required for our family to be whole again after 15 years of believing he was gone forever. My mother sat beside me in her wheelchair. Her mobility had worsened over the winter, but her spirits had improved dramatically once we'd learned the truth about my father's disappearance. The knowledge that he hadn't abandoned us, that he'd spent 15 years working and saving and hoping to come home, had lifted a weight from her shoulders that she'd carried since 2010. Flight 247 from Miami now arriving at Gate B15, the airport announcer called out. My father had flown from Belize to Miami, then taken a domestic flight to Denver under his new legal identity, David M. Tucker, a retired fishing guide moving to Colorado for health reasons. Castellano's contacts had provided documentation that would satisfy any reasonable scrutiny while protecting him from anyone who might still be looking for the David Thompson who'd disappeared 15 years ago. Passengers began emerging from the jetway, and I scanned each face anxiously. Then I saw him, older than the man in the surveillance photos Castellano had shown me, his hair completely grey and his skin weathered from years in the tropical sun, but unmistakably my father. He walked slowly, uncertainly, carrying a small duffel bag and looking around the terminal as if he couldn't quite believe he was really here. When his eyes found mine, he stopped walking entirely, and I saw him mouth the word Marcus as if testing whether it was real. I walked toward him, my mother rolling alongside in her wheelchair, and we met in the middle of the busy terminal. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, father and son separated by 15 years but connected by blood and love that time and distance couldn't break. "Hello, son," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered, either from emotion or simply from years of speaking primarily Spanish to tourists and locals in Belize. "Welcome home, Dad," I replied, and stepped forward to embrace him. He felt smaller than I remembered, thinner, but when he hugged me back I could feel the strength that had sustained him through 15 years of exile. Over his shoulder, I saw other travelers moving past us, caught up in their own arrivals and departures, unaware that they were witnessing a miracle 15 years in the making. When we finally separated, he knelt beside my mother's wheelchair and took her hands in his. Both of them were crying, but they were also smiling, and I could see that despite everything, despite the years and the distance and the circumstances that had torn them apart, they still loved each other. "I got old," she said through her tears, the same words she'd spoken to me months earlier when she'd first learned he was alive. "You got more beautiful," he replied, just as he had in the letter Castellano had shown me. The drive to Grand Junction gave us 4 hours to begin the process of becoming a family again. My father sat in the passenger seat of my truck, marveling at how much Denver had grown and changed, asking questions about my mother's health, my job, the friends and neighbors he'd left behind. But mostly we talked about the 15 years he'd been gone, the small house near the water where he'd lived under the name Daniel Tucker, the fishing boat he'd bought and operated, taking tourists out to catch tarpon and snapper in the warm waters off the Belizean coast. The simple routine of someone living under an assumed identity, always careful, always aware that a single mistake could bring dangerous attention. "I followed your lives as much as I could," he told us, as we drove through the Colorado mountains. "Vincent would send me updates, newspaper clippings about your high school graduation, information about your mother's health, details about your jobs and relationships. It wasn't enough, but it was something." "Why didn't you ever try to contact us directly?" I asked. "Even just to let us know you were okay?" "Because I knew that any contact would put you at risk. Romano's people had long memories and extensive resources. As long as they believed I might be dead, you were safe. But the moment they suspected I was alive and in touch with my family..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We'd all learned enough about Tony Romano and his associates to understand the kind of people who would hurt innocent family members to get what they wanted. But there was another reason for his silence, one that was harder for him to admit. "I was also ashamed," he said quietly, staring out at the mountain scenery. "I'd made choices that put my family in danger. I'd gotten involved with people I should have avoided. And when it came time to choose between my work and your safety, I chose your safety. But I also chose to handle it in a way that caused you both tremendous pain. You protected us," my mother said from the back seat. "That's what matters." "I abandoned you," he replied. "Maybe it was necessary. Maybe it was the only option available. But I still abandoned my family when you needed me most. I've had 15 years to think about whether I could have handled it differently, and I'm still not sure I made the right choice." That evening, we sat on the back porch of my mother's house in Grand Junction, watching the sun set over the Colorado landscape that my father hadn't seen in 15 years. The house looked smaller and more worn than when he'd left, but it was still home, still the place where our family had been happiest. "What happens now?" I asked as the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. "Now we figure out how to be a family again," my father said. "It won't be easy. We've all changed, and there's a lot of lost time to make up for. But we have something that money can't buy. We have time. All the time in the world." Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt the relationships that had been fractured by 15 years of separation. My father used his accumulated assets to start a small business, a precious metals and coin shop in Denver, combining his expertise with the collection that had brought us back together. My mother's health improved dramatically once the stress of financial worry was removed from her life, and she was able to afford the specialists and treatments that her insurance had only partially covered. And I finally understood what my father had meant in his letters about the most important things being hidden in plain sight. The real treasure hadn't been the silver coins or the Montana account or the Phoenix properties. The real treasure had been the love that had sustained us through 15 years of separation, the hope that had kept him working and saving for our future, and the strength that had brought our family back together despite impossible odds. 1 year after that storage auction, I stood in my father's new shop, watching him help a customer evaluate a collection of silver coins. He moved with confidence and expertise, explaining the factors that affected value, the importance of proper grading, the investment potential of precious metals. This was the man he'd always been underneath the cover story of selling insurance, knowledgeable, professional, someone who understood the value of planning for the future. "That was a good sale," I said, after the customer left with a portfolio of Silver Eagles and Morgan dollars. "It was," he agreed. "But you know what the best part is?" "What's that?" "At the end of the day, I get to go home to my family. For 15 years, I went to sleep every night in a house that wasn't really mine, in a country that wasn't really home, wondering if I'd ever see you and your mother again. Now I get to go home to the people I love, and I never have to wonder about that again." As we locked up the shop and walked to my truck, I thought about the chain of events that had brought us to this moment. A random storage auction, $95, and curiosity about a unit that had felt familiar. All of it leading to the discovery that love doesn't disappear when people do, that sacrifice sometimes looks like abandonment, and that some mysteries take 15 years to solve but are worth every day of waiting when they finally reveal their secrets. The silver coins had been valuable, but they'd never been the point. They'd been a message from a father to his son, a promise that love could survive any separation, and a hope that someday, somehow, families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control could find their way back to each other. That storage unit had cost me $95 and changed my life forever. But the real treasure, having my father home, seeing my parents together again, knowing that our family was finally whole, that was worth more than all the silver in the world. Some stories take 15 years to finish, but when they do, they remind us that the most valuable things in life aren't found in abandoned storage units or hidden bank accounts. They're found in the courage to keep hoping, the strength to keep searching, and the love that never stops believing that everyone deserves a chance to come home.